Hi guys, it's Adam and welcome to another video. So in today's video we are going to do a book review and it's going to be on this little book here, Meetings with Jung by E.A. Bennett. Now I don't really do book reviews much on this channel. I think I might have done one or two in the past if I remember rightly. Maybe I've not done any, but I feel like I've done one or two in the past. So I want to kind of bring this into the channel a little bit more. I want to do a few book reviews, but we'll see how things go. So this book here, if you're interested in buying it, I'll probably put the link down below as well to Amazon or eBay or something like that. It's a really nice book. Now, E.A. Bennett was closer with Jung. He was a closer friend than a lot of the other first generation of Jungian analysts. So I'm talking Dr. Joe Wheelwright, Dr. Marie-Louise van Franz, Dr. Liliane Frey Rohn, I can never pronounce that, Barbara Hanna, all these people, loads, I could list loads and loads and loads, Dr. C.A. Meyer, all these people that obviously if you're into Jungian stuff you will be familiar with, you will know of the names, all the rest of it. Now E.A. Bennett was closer to the Jung family as well, and he had a better relationship with the Jung family. He even went, and it's talked about in this book, I don't know whether it was his 75th birthday or it was his 80th birthday, Jung's 75th or Jung's 80th, but he went on I think it was a boat trip with the Jung family, and there was a lot of people there, and he was one of the only kind of outsiders from outside the family to be invited to that actual event. So he was more closer with the Jung family. The other analysts from the first generation, ones I've just mentioned there, and others of course, because there was a lot, they weren't, let's say, as close with the Jung family specifically. It's not to say that they never saw them, but when they did see them, they weren't particularly close with them. They didn't really have relationships with them, friendships or anything like that, from what I can gather from interviews and books that I've read on, of course, Jung's kind of inner circle, if you will. Now, E.A. Bennett wasn't with Jung all the time. He didn't visit him all the time or anything like that, because he was obviously elsewhere, and he was wanting to establish both Jung's ideas and also kind of, because he was quite open-minded, he also looked at other things outside of Jung and basically put these things into obviously a practice of psychoanalysis in a more holistic way as well. But it is very, very fair to say that E.A. Bennett was quite faithful to Jung's ideas, and he obviously explored them and used Jung's ideas quite prominently in any sort of psychoanalysis. Now, this book is really nice. It really is really nice. It really gives a side to Jung that I think many people know when they're reading him, but it really highlights that side to him, and it really enhances it, because this is a personal conversations and personal notes book. It is basically a diary. That is what you are reading in this book. You are reading a diary of E.A. Bennett's conversations with Jung. I mean, it says it right here, conversations recorded during the years 1946 to 1961. Now, Bennett did know Jung prior to the war in the 1930s. I don't know the exact year they met. I think it was in the early 30s. So he did know him for quite a while. But of course, during the war years, I don't really think they had as much contact. Certainly, I don't think he went to visit him or anything like that. But then between the years of 1946 and 1961, those 15 years, there was a lot more visits to Switzerland by Bennett, and a lot more conversation there. And of course, he was very, very close to Jung. He went in his study, and it's all talked about in this book. Many, many nights they went in the study, and they were chatting together about various different concepts, both in Jung's own analytical psychology, but also just generally in psychology and psychiatry. They talked about all different things. Of course, we know that Jung was incredibly high in trait openness, and I mean, it really is shown in this book how high Jung was in trait openness. I mean, he just discusses things in these conversations that you think, that's so trivial, but yet it's brilliant that he's discussed it. You think, what? I wouldn't have thought to discuss that tiny little thing. It's like the tiniest little thing, and it's like the tiniest little thing in psychology or whatever, but yet it's brilliant. And you think, how the hell did he even think to discuss it in this book? Like, how the hell did he even think to have that conversation and to go down that road when most people would just brush it off? And I think that's really the brilliance of Jung. It wasn't all of these highbrow concepts that we all know about the collective unconscious or the anima, the animus, the shadow being one of the most brilliant concepts as well. But it wasn't necessarily all that. It was his ability not to take anything as trivial or anything for granted. He would go through everything. He would look at everything, and he would give it the time, and he would look at it and analyse it in a psychological manner and in an empirical and philosophical manner as well. Although Jung, of course, himself wouldn't call himself a philosopher, he's actually stated that it was either an essay or a book of his somewhere. He says, I am not a philosopher. Although he says that, of course, there's a lot of philosophical thinking that goes on and that went on within his life. And so, of course, he does have that kind of empirical and philosophical kind of angle when looking at all the different things in life. And it really comes out in this book as well. He talks a lot, if you want to know, just brief ideas in this book as well, because that's something that we should cover. He talks about number symbolism. He talks about the way in which numbers might not just be conceptual. So, for example, we could say in a philosophical, a very basic philosophical understanding, well, of course, we attribute the number 2 or the number 5 to something. There isn't actually something that exists called that's 2 or that's 5. That's just a conception that we've created to put on something. But Jung argues that numbers have a physical existence, and that we discovered numbers. We didn't just apply numbers to the world, but we discovered them from the world. So, for example, I'll explain this very briefly here. We have 2 eyes, and that is a physical reality. There are obviously 2 there. Now, you could make the argument quite comfortably, well, we applied the conception to those eyes. But maybe it's the case that we derived the conception of 2 from the fact that there is 2 things there. So therefore, there's a physical link there. Even if it's like not, let's say, a complete physical link or anything like that, there's some sort of discovery of numbers that went on, you see? And that's very, very interesting. And if that's the case, that definitely has prominent applications for symbolism in dreams, and it has prominent applications for psychological things that go on in people's lives, and even psychological things as relating to the physical sphere and the physiology of an individual as well, which again is quite interesting, and it kind of amplifies the value and the importance given to number symbolism in dreams. So that was very interesting. There's a lot of stories in here about a medicine man in Zurich, and they are very, very interesting stories. Now, I'm not going to recite them because it's been a couple of weeks since I've read this book, and I probably could do, but I might be getting them a little bit wrong. I might say something a little bit wrong here and there. And if you're thinking about reading this book anyway, obviously I don't want to necessarily just spoil all the stories for you or anything like that. But there are a lot of stories in here about a medicine man in Zurich. Jung actually met this medicine man, and he was quite impressed by this medicine man as well. And this medicine man would sort of do these old techniques to cure people of various different things. Now, I'm not necessarily talking about herbal medicine or anything like that here, not particularly the kind of traditional medicine man remedies and stuff that, we still find today in kind of tribes, hidden tribes in Africa and places like that, and even to degrees in, obviously, America with the tribes over there, and the Indian tribes and stuff over there, but not so much that, but the psychological side of it. And this medicine man really knows, he has a very, very earthly, grounded, intuitive wisdom that we'd say is like an old, archaic wisdom that really gets down to the bones, shall we say. And this medicine man cures people of their kind of psychological distresses, for example, by just doing the most odd, simple things. And he even cures cows as well of distress. And I think one of the stories in here is about him or someone, maybe the farmer himself, dressing up as a woman to milk the cows, because the cows were distressed by the fact one of the milking ladies had gone away, and they were getting milked by a man, you see. And so what he said was, dress up as a woman and the cows won't be distressed anymore, and they'll produce more milk and all the rest of it, or whatever it was. And so they did that, and it worked, and the cows weren't distracted. And I thought that was that's like real old psychology, you see. That's old psychology. You don't learn about things like that in any sort of modern psychological setting, in terms of whether you're doing a degree or a course or counselling or anything. That's earthly wisdom. That's intuitive, instinctual wisdom. That is old stuff. That's why I enjoy Jung, because you've got that very earthly nature there, instinctual earthly nature. So there's stuff like that in there. There's stuff on synchronicity, of course, and they do go into a bit of depth of synchronicity in this book. Not like incredible depth in terms of, mathematically or anything like that per se. There's a little bit on probabilities and stuff in here. Again, not so much on the mathematical side, but more of a kind of just a philosophical chat about probabilities and synchronicity, which is very, very interesting. It gives this is something I've wanted to know for a long time, Jung's ideas on probability and synchronicity and all that sort of stuff, and it's explained in this book. Now, I've not actually read the main book of synchronicity by Jung. It is on my shelf, but I've not read it yet, so obviously there'll probably be a lot more about it in there. Of course, I know the main idea of synchronicity, and I know it in some depth, let's say, and I've had many, I mean, it really does warrant that many's, loads of experience. I have it on a daily basis. I have synchronicity come up bloody 5 times a day these days. It's ridiculous. And when I say synchronicity, I mean like small things, and then other times I mean bigger things, and all the rest of it, And you can get into an experience as well where you can actually intuitively perceive synchronous events happening by your own thoughts. It's very, very well. Right. So I'll give you an example. I was at my friend's house yesterday. They have a new puppy. Lovely little puppy. Very exuberant. Very instinctual. Very, very instinctual personality. And she's running around and she's chasing this other dog that's in the garden, and she's playing with my friends and stuff. And I think to myself, Millie, which is the name of the dog, I think, Millie, come here. And I think that, and I direct that piercingly at her. And the weirdest thing happened. She stopped for a second. She looked up. Now, I didn't say anything. I just thought this in my mind. And she stopped for a minute and she looked round dazed like this. Like, where did that come from? And then she ran, I kid you not, she ran over to me. And then once she had ran over to me for about 2 minutes, she had gone away again. But you see, that's synchronous. And that's the unas mundas. That's the one world that connects us all. And so that shows in a very, very primitive fashion the connections and the ability to tune in intuitively to this one world, the Jijimuge in the Japanese conception, the interrelation and interconnection of all things. And if you can get to that state of oneness, shall we say, and you can intuitively perceive that oneness and feel that oneness, you can actually have an influence on it. It's very, very weird, very, very weird. And it obviously, the yogis and the Zen masters and stuff, a lot of them can get to a very, very high level of intuition and understanding these connections and being able to influence things based on obviously this kind of interrelation, interconnection. It is purported, shall we say, that the rascal guru George Ivan Gurdjieff could actually influence people's actions and behaviour based on this very, very vast intuition that he's got about this kind of relation. Now, I'm not too into the whole rascal because I like to be more centred and more, let's say, more Jungian in my outlook rather than so much on the very, very spiritual guru side of things, because you can get a bit bogged down in that, and there's a lot of egotism and stuff in that. But nonetheless, it's interesting to hear that and to read that and to relate it to certain experiences I've had and certain experiences other people have had and possibly Jung had as well. And so that was a synchronous experience, you see, because I didn't say anything. My causality necessarily wasn't affecting that connection, whereas that just happened at the same time. It was a meaningful coincidence. I thought it, and then she came over to me. It was just a synchronous experience. And there wasn't really, you could argue, and I will be open-minded about this, you could argue that there could have been sense perceptions, very, very, very unconscious to me, both psychologically, physiologically, whatever, in my body language. Maybe it was something unconscious that I did in my body language. I wouldn't have said so because I was sat there pretty still. But maybe it was just like some little rise in my finger or something that happened unconsciously to me. She saw that and then she came running over to me, because she is quite an exuberant puppy, and she's very, very curious. So even if I did maybe just raise my hand or something, she may have come over, but I know I didn't. I don't feel like I had done that. But you see, the unconscious is always unconscious, so you never know what you're doing, you see. Even anatomically, well, not anatomically, even physiologically, but in behaviour terms, you still can be unconscious of those things, you see. So it's very, very hard when you're trying to observe yourself and actually get it right, and understand what's gone on there. But all I can say was that I was sat very still, and I don't believe that I raised my hand or anything, but you don't know, you can never be sure. But there is things on synchronicity in here, so that's cool. There's also a little bit, and let me see if I can find the page, and you know what it's like when you try and find a page in a book, and then you can never find it when you want to find it. I don't think it's that far. But it's a very, very nice little conception of the... there it is. It's a very, very nice little conception that draws upon the yin and yang. I don't know if you can see that diagram there. You see that? Thinking... what does it say? Thinking, feeling at the bottom there, sensing, intuition. And of course, that's Jungian typology. And I've discussed Jungian typology before, I won't go into it. There's very, very good reason to assume this could be correct from newfound understanding in neuropsychology and neuroscience and things like that, particularly with obviously the structures, as I've talked about before, prefrontal cortex, amygdala, things like that, for obviously thinking, feeling types and stuff, and the way those structures differ in different people, and the way in which people behaviourally reinforce their thinking or behaviourally reinforce their feeling over time in life in a socialised setting. So even whether the Jungian types, obviously Jung would say that they're more innate, based on the archetypes and things like that, but even if you are to say, well, they're socialised, there is some definite relations there, and I would argue for the Jungian typology, even though many people would argue against it. Now, of course, what I would say is that it is a very, very basic system. It's not a intricate system, but that's the beauty of it. I don't know who it was who talked about something being simple. I think it was Einstein, wasn't it, who said that if you really understand something, you will talk about it in the most simple terms possible, because you can only talk about it in the most simple terms possible if you understand it fully. And so I think any conceptions that we're deriving on phenomena need to be as simple as possible. So that, I feel, the simplicity of the Jungian typology is the beauty of it. And yes, okay, we could get bogged down in making things more convoluted and making things more complex and stuff, and going into it like that. But it's just superfluous, in my opinion. It's not necessary. So this was something that really struck a chord with me, and what I'll talk about this very briefly, and we'll end then, because of course we've done 20 minutes here. Thus, if a man is predominantly a thinking type, he begins to speculate, so he takes in intuition, the knowledge from the unconscious. But he wants to then see how it relates to facts, and so sensation is included. This results in a triangle which excludes feeling. Now, of course, that struck a chord with me immediately, because I have done that for so long. I'm not necessarily a thinking type, but I've still done that very much so in my philosophical ruminations, shall we say. And it's very much true. When you start thinking, you, of course, start taking an intuition. You start to have a gut feeling about things that you're thinking of, and you're thinking, well, how does this, there's something to this, and da-da-da-da, and you start to get intuitive about it. But then what happens is you start to observe in a sensing way the world, and you take in more information that way, and then you intuit and things like that, and you think as well, but you're always excluding feeling. You're always excluding feeling, and it happens so much with me. Whenever I'm really into my thinking mode of being, shall we say, the thinking function, as Jung would say, I'm not a feeler at all. My feeling's gone. I actually get pissed off with people because they interrupt. When someone talks to me about something, Adam, your grandma wants you to do this, or da-da-da, or someone wants you to do this, or whatever it may be. I sometimes, if I'm really in that thinking mode, and I'm really in that, insular, introverted domain of trying to structure conceptions and stuff, I can be quite blunt with people and stuff, because I've completely excluded feeling in those moments. I've just gone for that thinking and that intuition that comes, because I'm an intuitive type, of course, that, intuition, and of course that sensing that just naturally is there from trying to look at things in the world to gain more kind of external sense knowledge to further my conceptions of the phenomena that I'm talking about, and the things I'm thinking about. But yeah, the feeling is totally excluding it. Then you just become cold and too rational and over rational. And Jung actually talks about in this book that I think it's on the next page. There we go. It says here, but the feeling is there, nevertheless. I had a hell of a lot of trouble with that, said CG. When feeling is left out, you get a narrow circle around thinking, the intellectual function. So, even Jung was there talking about that. He was that made me smile as well, because it's what I have. I was like, oh right, so he had trouble with that as well, because that made me think, oh thank God, because I always have trouble with that. But yeah, it's and I can imagine he had a lot of battle. Jung himself had a lot of battles with that, with trying to include feeling. That's what I'm doing at the moment. I'm trying to go through this period of really getting a strong relationship with my feeling function, and it's incredibly hard. After you've reinforced that thinking attitude for so long, for so many years, and so that's very interesting. So there is a lot in this book. It's a rich book. It really is a rich book. I'll just read the blurb on the back to finish anyway. This volume consists of a collection of personal notes recorded by the English medical doctor E.A. Bennett during his visits with the Swiss psychiatrist C.G. Jung. The notes provide the basis for Bennett's books, What Jung Really Said, which actually, funnily enough, I've just got on the shelf up there. It's like that second one down. And C.G. Jung. And in this edition, they appear in their original and complete form for the first time. Not only do the Bennett-Jung conversations, as recorded here, serve to clarify many psychological concepts and ideas, they also testify to a warm friendship spanning 3 decades and to a common deep concern for the welfare of humankind. And I think that little bit of blurb there really does this book justice. Now, one thing that I'll end on is that, of course, because these are diary notes, a lot of it is okay, and you can read it and it'll flow as if it's a book. But certainly sort of the first few pages, and here and there elsewhere in the book as well, there's more kind of like bullet points, if you like. They're not wrote in bullet points, of course, they're wrote in flowing text, but it's almost like he's just wrote one line down about one thing and then moved on. And so sometimes, you get out of the flow a bit because of that, and then you come back into the flow a bit. So that can sometimes be a bit, there can be a bit of a disconnect there, but then you get back into the flow again. And it's really because the style of this diary is, in parts it goes into more depth about what happened in the day, but then in other parts there'll just be one line, and so yeah, it can kind of feel a bit disjointed here and there. But it's nothing too crazy or anything. You can get into it quite easily. It's not. It's just something to point out, of course. Just because obviously I'm doing this review, and I think it's seminal to point things out like that in a video like this. So with that being said, I'll leave it there. So that is the book there. As I say, I'll put some links down below. Really, really good book. If you are in the Jungian, if you're in that Jungian way of thinking, you like Jung, you like that kind of attitude in psychology, read this book. I would say probably read it after you've read some other books, because it's one of those books that's really for the student of Jung. It's not really for someone who's, because I consider myself a student of Jung. Like, he's the person who I, let's say, take inspiration from, but not only take inspiration from, like, I orient my philosophical investigations around, because included in Jung is all the philosophers. Kantian philosophy is in there, Nietzschean philosophy is in there, I don't even know how to pronounce that, Choperian philosophy, maybe that's the right way of pronouncing it. Choperian philosophy is in there. You name it. Jung brought together loads of philosophers and put them into a psychology, basically. And not only that, Freud's within Jung, and as a subset of Jung, all these psychiatrists, psychologists are kind of a subset of Jung. There's a lot of humanistic psychology kind of condensed within the idea of individuation as well. For example, with peak experiences, not only that, but self-transcendence, self-actualization, those concepts are kind of condensed ideas of individuation, as I've touched on before. So everything encapsulated within Jung. So it's like when you're a physicist, who do you read? Who do you go to? Well, of course, you go to Einstein, right? Or you go to one of the big guys today. You don't go for someone who was like kind of okay. You go for one of the real good ones. So it's like when I approached psychology, luckily I just naturally found Jung one of the first anyway, which was very good. But when you become a psychologist or psychiatrist, who do you go to? Well, you go to one of the top. So you go to Jung. If you're a philosopher, who do you go to first? Kant, obviously, or Aristotle, maybe. But I mean, a lot of things in Aristotle are now disproven. Few of them remain still quite good, but the foundations are there, like within it, and there's still things that you can learn. I mean, his ideas of actualization, and I forget the concepts. Is it potential and actualization or something like that? When he's talking about the chicken and things like that. Oh, that is a brilliant idea, but I've forgot part of it now. But no, that is a really good idea. So there's still some good things in Aristotle. But you go to Kant, or you go to Aristotle, or you go to maybe Plato, or I don't know. I'd probably say them. Like, you could go to one of the Stoics, but it doesn't really give you like as rounded stuff. Like, if you know Kant, you know a lot of philosophy. If you know, like, Aristotle wrote on loads of different things as well. I swear he wrote like crazy amounts. Like, I'm talking crazy amounts. So, you go to those people, you get a good well-rounded view. I mean, Plato to a degree as well. Plato's quite good. And again, there's a lot of Plato in Jung as well. There's a lot of Plato in Jung, especially with the idea of like the theory of forms and things like that. You can definitely see those relations to the archetypes and stuff. So, you know, those are the people. So you don't, when you become a physicist, you don't go to someone really low down. You go to the better ones. When you become a psychologist, you go to the better ones. When you become a doctor, you go to, well, again, psychiatrist or whatever, you go to the better one, etc, etc, etc. So there's no point reading the crap ones. And philosophers talk about this. Loads of different famous philosophers talk about this, how you should read the best people. You don't read the real low down crap ones. Now, I mean, I read a good variety, but I do try and stick to the good names, because that's how you've not got forever. You can't read everything, so you've got to go for the better people. And so many people talk about this, it's nothing new. So yeah, you know, I would say this is a good book if you are a student of Jung. If you are just wanting to know a little bit about Jungian psychology, maybe just get the short introduction to Jung. I've got it on my shelf up there on one of those two things. Just a very, very short book. It's one of the Oxford short introduction books, which is generally about 100 pages. And it's a great introduction, that book. And that's all you need to read, because you might not want to go into Jung that much. But, you know, if you're reading that and you're reading the Jungian analysts as well, like Marie-Louise von Franz and people like that, Barbara Hanna, if you're reading Jung's books as well, and if you've really gone into it, and maybe you've watched the Jung interviews, you've watched the Lost Zurich tapes, you've watched the Remembering Jung interviews, you've watched Matter of the Heart documentary, you've watched The Way of the Dream documentary, you've watched all these things like the students of Jung do, then that's the book for you. That's what you want to read. Because if you don't understand Jung's concepts, this book is going to be a bit challenging, not really challenging, but a bit alienating is more the word. So you need to know Jung's concept, then you'll get it, when you're like, brilliant. And then and you're like, oh yeah, that was a brilliant read, that. And it was an easy read for me, because I know Jung's concept fairly well now. And I've basically, my book, Revelations of the Self, it went through, and I thought about everything that Jung thought about in terms of doing the archetypes and the collective unconscious. Obviously not to the depth that he thought about it, because that would be insane. But I thought about it to the depth that I can go and that I have access to. And so doing that and structuring that book, which is actually a 600-page book, which is mental. I didn't realise it was, but I'd formatted it the wrong way. So I formatted it and wrote it in A4 on a document. I don't know why, because I always format it in like A5 or whatever. I think it's like sometimes I format it in 17.48 centimeters by like 23 or 25 centimeters. That seems to be a good kind of page size for when you're printing it. I do my poetry books in most of them in that, except from The Mind of the Eccentric, which I've got again up there somewhere. I think it's that one there. You see that like little sliver of paper there? I think that's Mind of the Eccentric. So I didn't realise. So it is actually a 288-page book, but by the time I've converted it to A5 and finished it off, it's going to be It's going to actually be a 600-page book, and that basically is. It's like the 21st century version of Archetypes and the Collective Unconscious, where I put in it new observations of the collective unconscious from a 21st century perspective, and add to it in a more kind of generational way, in a furthering way, shall we say, to the best of what I can do, of course, because I don't have incredible knowledge or anything like that. I've not got incredible knowledge on the body like Jung had or anything like that. So I've just done it to the degree that I can do it. But doing that has meant that I can read Jung and I can read the Jungian analysts. Obviously, it's still hard in places. Jung is bloody hard in places, like especially like Ion and things like that. But I can read them, and it's not like intolerable. I can just about read them, and I'm all right with it. And maybe a few pages here and there I think, oh God, I didn't really understand that bit. But for the most part, I'm sort of okay now. And that comes from doing my own creative work. And Marie-Louise von Franz actually mentions in, now, what interview was that? That might have been the Matter of the Heart documentary. I think it was. And Marie-Louise von Franz says in that basically whenever she does creative work, that's to say whenever she is really trying to observe Jung's psychology as an empirical reality, and whenever she's kind of really thinking about these concepts, and whenever she's reading old texts of alchemy or whatever it may be, then she starts to be able to read Jung and understand it. But when she doesn't do that and she's reading Jung, she doesn't understand it. So that's where I've been able to luckily understand Jung more, by doing this, by writing this book at the same time as reading him. And then I've been able to really access his understanding, because I've not only been making empirical observations of the archetypes for the book, of course, but then I've been reinforcing my knowledge by writing it down in the book, then going back to it and reading over it, and then going back to empirical reality and observing the archetypes there again, and learning new things and having new intellectual revelations. And that's why it's called Revelations of the Self, by the way, because it is like I've had revelations. It's weird. And then you go back to Jung and you're like, oh yeah, I understand that, because he's talking about this thing that I learned in my own experience. Because what Marie-Louise von Franz says is you have to make it your own through your own experience. Otherwise, it's not yours. If you can observe the archetypes yourself through your own experiences, then it's yours, because you know it. You know it in your own experience. You've seen the archetypes. You've seen the different nuances of the archetypes and the things that have come along from your own observations. But if you just read Jung and you don't do that work and that creative work, and you don't write down your observations after the fact, then it's gone. It's not yours. It's not in your reality. It's not really there. You've not perceived it. It's the same about talking about the shadow, with regards to integration of the shadow. You can talk about the shadow all you want. It's never going to integrate it. You have to actively do things. You have to actively go into your fears. Jung says in a letter, and I don't know what letter it is because, God, he did hundreds of letters. But he says to someone who's writing to him, he says, where there is fear, therein lies your task. The quote is practically that. I'm paraphrasing very slightly. And that's what you have to do. And it's incredibly hard. And this is why Anelia Jaffray says about individuation being a dying to life. It's exactly the same thing. And so you have to go into those experiences. You have to expose yourself psychologically, and you have to, you could say in a spiritual sense, you have to make the ego afraid and put yourself out there. And then the more you do that, the less ego there is in that situation, and the more comfort there becomes. It's exposure therapy. And exposure therapy is really one of the longest standing psychological concepts we have had, even if it hasn't at certain times in history been recognised as a concept as such. All the rascal gurus, even from the 14th century, 15th century there, or even going back in a sense to Buddhism as well, there's all little things of exposure therapy there. Of course, the Zen masters are the most brilliant people at, and also the Christian mystics, to a sense, the rascal gurus there. They're the most brilliant at, well, we could say back in those days, immoral exposure therapy, where they're basically forcing people to do things they disliked, and even with some of the mystics, throwing themselves on people in a way that the mystics themselves, who were supposedly enlightened, they would go to these people and try and thrust them out of the ego. And so, but there's a lot of there's a lot of a lack of morality in that. And so these days, when we do exposure therapy, we do it in incremental terms, and that's been, I won't say the word proven, but it's been kind of shown to be most effective that way, rather than in a one big hit. If you do something called behavioral shaping in behaviorism, and you slowly introduce someone to something that they fear, then that can have very, very positive effects over the long term. And all that is a 21st century moral version of what the spiritual gurus were doing in the 14th, 15th century to get people out of the ego. It's getting people out of the ego in a more regimented, nice, kind, moral setting of the 21st century. And that's exactly how it should be. That's exactly how it should have gone. And that's the synthesis of psychology from spirituality, shall we say. And so therefore there is a lot of those kind of spiritual ideas within psychology as a kind of hidden idea underneath behaviorism and underneath 20th and 21st century concepts within psychology. Now, of course, if you're not aware of the old rascal gurus, you're not aware about the psychology of Buddhism, you're not aware about these things, the real history of religion and psychology and spirituality and psychology and those connections, you won't realize and you won't see these links that are hidden underneath. And now, if you know that history, then what you can do is you can use that knowledge in line with the principles that of the modern era, and you can really start to understand why this is the way it is, and why we use behavioral shaping in such a way, and what the end goal is. And the end goal, of course, is really in a very, very basic setting and in a more spiritual context to get people out of the ego. That's what it is. Now, obviously, some people say, well, it's to reduce someone's fears and all that. Well, that's just a way of saying getting someone out of the ego, basically. So you're reducing the fear, getting them out of the ego, and getting them to a higher level of development in the process. Whether we want to say spiritual development or psychological development, in my eyes, it's synonymous. It's the same thing. So with that being said, I've rambled for a long time there. It's 41 minutes. I hope you enjoyed that little book review, and, of course, the little ramble of psychology at the end there as well, about various different concepts and stuff. But yeah, I'll leave it there. Thank you very much for watching, guys, and I will see you in the next one. What I will do is I will also do another book review very soon, and I will publish that whenever is necessary. So I will see you very soon.